Hello students, welcome to your economics class. So before we start today's topic, let us do a short recap of what we did yesterday. The topic we covered yesterday was very important, and I made quite a long video wherein I included the questions, the solutions of the chapter test 2. So let us just do a short recap and let's go through the next topic of discussion. So what we have done in the last class, basically we discussed that in the last 40 years the tertiary sector has evolved as the major sector of the economy, and it has evolved as the major contributor to the GDP, and the reasons associated with it are as follows. Number one, as all the basic services are government sponsored services, so they grow automatically. That's the first reason. Secondly, because the primary sector and the secondary sector are totally dependent on the tertiary sector, which is a connecting sector, so when these two sectors see a growth, automatically the tertiary sector also grows. Third, the money in hand or the income of the people has seen an increase over the last 40 years, and when there is more money to spend, people go and spend it in leisure activities. It could be going out to eat somewhere, going for a movie, buying more clothes, going to a better school, going for a private hospital treatment, so on and so forth. So automatically all these services have seen a growth. Then comes that the other services. There are many services, especially banking, e-commerce, and call centers. These are all services associated with the technological advancements which are related to communication and information technology. And because the information technology has seen a growth, these sectors have also evolved. Finally, the government has approved and designed the LPG, that is the liberalization, privatization and globalization policy around early 90s, and as a result of which a lot of improvement has happened in the tertiary sector. So this LPG policy we'll discuss in details in our chapter number 4 too. But as of now, just understand that because of these three policies, the country has become a free country in terms of trade, wherein people from outside country can come and set up businesses in our country, wherein we can also go outside and sell our products. So basically it is a policy of free trade, and wherein the private players, the private companies can also operate schools, operate businesses and set up businesses too, and it is not necessary that all the businesses should be run by the government. Okay. So these are the reasons. But in spite of this, the tertiary sector has, in spite of the fact that the tertiary sector has seen a lot of growth, there are it is happening only in some parts of the tertiary sector. That is the disparity happening. There is no uniform growth in the tertiary sector. Some parts of the tertiary sector has seen better growth compared to the other parts. For example, the people who are involved in who are having low skills or who do not have a permanent sort of a job, those people are not the ones who have seen a growth that the tertiary sector is promising or showing. These people are doing these jobs because there is no other choice or no other alternative for them. Okay, so let's come to the learning objectives for today's class. Today we are going to discuss and find out in which part of the economy most of the people are employed in. Means we'll find out that out of primary, secondary and tertiary, which is that part of the economy, which sector, where then the maximum number of people are employed and why. Okay. Also we will do a graphical study and compare and analyze the share of the sectors of the economy in GDP and in employment. Also, we will try to understand through two different graphs that what is the contribution of these three sectors towards GDP and towards employment. Now before that, let's just recall one small thing, that is, whenever we do comparison between the three sectors, there are two factors we take into consideration, right? What are those two factors? Number one, we'll see how much is the contribution of each sector towards GDP. That is first, okay, while doing comparison. So accordingly we'll find out which sector is doing better. Secondly, we also find out the number of people employed in each sector. Whichever sector has maximum number of people employed, that sector we consider is doing better. Okay, so let's move on to graph number 2, page number 25 of your textbook. Now this is the graph which basically is showing the percentage share of the 3 sectors in GDP. It is basically showing how much is the contribution of the 3 sectors towards the GDP, and that too, this graph is showing 2 different bars if you notice it. The first bar is basically showing the growth or the contribution of the 3 sectors towards the economy or in the GDP in percentage in the year 1973-74. Then after a gap of 40 years, around 2013-14, what is the trend? That pattern is shown in the second bar or the column. So we see that around 1970s, primary sector, which is shown in blue, is the highest and the largest contributor towards the GDP. But after 40 years, it is seen that the same sector's contribution towards the GDP has come down. If you see the blue color, it has come down in the next column. But also we see a different trend. We also see that the green color, which is the tertiary sector, their contribution towards the GDP was less 40 years back. But now their contribution towards the GDP in 2013-14 is much more, and it is clearly shown in the graph. Their percentage share is much more. So what do you see and understand? We basically see a shift of the economy from the primary to the secondary. We see the changing importance of the sectors over the last 40 years, and from this graph we have understood that the tertiary sector has emerged as the largest producing sector in the country. So this is a question which comes in the exam, like which is the sector which was the most or largest producing sector in the initial years? Then your answer is primary sector. But if the same question is asked, that which is the sector which is the largest producing sector? Producing means GDP, okay? Anything relating to produce is GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. So in short, we say production, produce. So the tertiary sector has evolved as the largest producing sector around 2013-14. So just remember this. So we see a shift in the economy. Now let's come to the next graph, graph number 3, same page number 25. This graph is showing the percentage share of the 3 sectors of the economy in employment. The last one was showing you the GDP, and this graph is showing you the employment. If you look at the graph, it is showing that around 1978-77, around 75% of the population, the working population means people who are above 18 years and below 60 years, okay? Remember we did it in class 9, the working population, the chapter people as resources. What is the working population? People who can work, the adults 18 years to 60 years, that working population, people who are the workforce, the manpower, the human resource of our country. So all the human resource of the country, out of which 71% was involved in the primary sector, which is represented in blue color. 71% means almost most of the people were engaged in the primary. That point of time 40 years back, secondary sector was still there, its contribution was 11%, and the tertiary sector's contribution in terms of employment was 18%, right? So vast difference. 40 years from then, now, that is 2017-18, that is what is my textbook says. It can vary in your book, the years can vary, but don't worry, this is the latest I am showing it to you. So now if you see that the contribution towards employment, that is the number of people working in the primary sector, has come down drastically from 71% to 44% in 40 years time. right? And the contribution of towards employment of secondary sector is 25%. It was 11%, now it is 25%. So it has seen an increase in the number of employment, number of people working in the secondary sector. Tertiary sector has seen a growth too, from 18%, now it is 31%. So that is one sector where the number of people engaged has come down from 71 to 44, and that is shown in this graph, and that is seen in the primary sector. So here it is not same as that of the shift in GDP. Here it is seen that the number of people engaged overall, if you look at it, 71% employment contribution was from the primary sector, right? So shift in employment is not same as the shift in GDP. So what we have understood, that actually, like in the GDP, what has happened? From primary to tertiary, the shift has happened. But in employment, it has not happened. Employment, if you look at both the graphs, yes, the number of people working in the primary sector was 71%, now it is 44%. But if you take into account all the three sectors, even now, the primary sector is the largest employer in the economy. It is 44%, yes, it has come down, but still it is compared to the other two sectors more. Look at the bar in 2017 and 18, it was 44%, it is 44%, right? But tertiary sector is 25 and 31, and secondary sector is 25. Same, it is still less than 44%, right? So even though in the last 40 years, the number of people working in primary sector has come down from 71% to 44%, but still the primary sector remains as the largest employer in the economy. Now that is something we need to understand more. So we see a shift in employment, but it is not same as a shift in the GDP. Primary sector has emerged even now after 40 years as the largest employer. Now the same thing, let's do a tabular representation of the data. Suppose around 1970s, who was the largest producing sector? Primary. And largest employer was primary sector in 70s, right? After 40 years, tertiary sector has become the largest producing sector, but the largest employer is still the primary sector. Right? So the shift in the share of GDP is not same as the shift or the share in employment. So from this table and from both the graphs that we have compared and seen, we have come to the conclusion that the shift in the share of GDP, that means the contribution of the three sectors towards GDP, is not the same as its contribution to the employment. Primary sector, even though the percentage has come down, is still the largest employer, which shouldn't have been the case. That is what we are going to discuss next. Why didn't a similar shift out of primary sector happen in case of employment? Now that is something we need to understand and ask and analyze why. This is a question which should come to our mind, that why, even though the tertiary sector has become the most important sector, has rose to power, has become the most powerful sector, but why is number of people employed in tertiary sector still less compared to primary sector? That is something to understand, analyze and worry about too. There must be something wrong somewhere. So let's do the analysis of that. So let's analyze and see what it is, why this is happening. Okay, so over the last years, over the last 40 years, in fact, in the secondary sector and in the tertiary sector, this is trend we have seen. We have seen that the secondary sector, the production of goods, because secondary sector produces goods, this production of goods went up by 9%. Suppose it was 1, it is into 1 into 9 is equal to 9. So it increased by 9 times. It's not percentage, it is 9 times. So it was, if it is 1 40 years back, now it has become 9 after 40 years. Okay. In terms of employment, but Even though the production has increased by 9 times, but the employment, that is the number of people employed in the secondary sector, has not become 9 times. It is only 3 times. Okay, suppose if the production is 9, then the employment is 3. So it is not equal in the secondary sector. Similar trend is in the tertiary sector, where we see that the number of final goods and services, especially services produced in the tertiary sector, has seen a growth by 14 times. But the pattern of number of people employed in the tertiary sector is only 5 times. Suppose it was 1 at the beginning of 40 years. Now after 40 years it has become 14, right? But the same growth is not seen in terms of employment, that is number of people working in the tertiary sector. It is only 5 times. So there is a huge gap between what is produced in these 2 sectors and the number of people working in these 2 sectors. This is what we need to understand. We need to know why this is happening. We need to understand the reason behind this, and the reason is this: because enough jobs are not created in the tertiary and the secondary sector. That is why the number of people working in both these sectors is lesser than the primary sector even now. Simple. The reason of why the number of people working in both this sector is less, even though the production is more than the primary sector, these 2 sectors now contribute more to the GDP. Even then the number of people working in these 2 sectors is less. And why it's so? Because the jobs which are there in these sectors, both these 2 sectors, is less compared to the primary sectors. People employment generation is less. We will discuss about employment and employment generation next in our next 2 classes, but this is the reason. So the facts are as follows. What are the facts? The first fact is that more than half of the working population of India are working in the primary sector. Almost more than 50% of the people, working population, is a part of the primary sector, mostly agriculture and agriculture related. But they produce only 1/4 of the GDP. They contribute only 25% of the GDP. But number of people working in this sector is more than 50%. That is fact number 1. Fact number 2 is that the secondary and the tertiary sector together, they contribute 3/4 of the GDP. And they generate or they contribute towards the GDP is 3/4. Okay, but they employ less than half of the working population, because more than half of the people are still employed in the primary sector. So rest of the people are employed together in the primary and the secondary sector, but they produce more. Their contribution to the GDP is still more, and it is something we really need to analyze and understand why. I have just said the reason is because the number of job opportunities together in the secondary and the tertiary sector is less compared to the primary sector. So the whole thing we can summarize by saying that the primary sector employs more than 50% of the population, working population, but they contributes towards GDP is only 1/4, that is 25%. But secondary and the tertiary sector together, in these 2 sectors together, less than 50% people are employed, but they contribute more to the GDP, that is 3/4 of the GDP. So 75% is their contribution towards the GDP. So this is how we summarize this topic, but I am not ending this topic here. We will be discussing the reason why this particular trend or pattern is seen in the employment sector. Why the growth in employment in tertiary and secondary sector is not high. That we'll discuss, but I leave you with the reason in short, which we'll discuss later on. The reason is that in the agricultural sector, more people are working than is necessary. More, if one person is required to work, 10 will be working there. And with that I leave you to think what we have studied so far. We have understood that there is a huge difference in the contribution of the three sectors in GDP and in employment. In GDP, we have seen that there is a shift from primary to tertiary, but the same shift or share is not seen in terms of employment. In employment, primary sector still remains as the largest employer in the economy, and the reason is simple, that the number of job opportunities in the secondary and the tertiary sector is less. Okay, and more people are still a part of the agriculture sector, that is the primary sector, than is required. We will continue with this topic in our next class, wherein we'll discuss the concept of unemployment, disguised unemployment, under unemployment in details. These are terms which you have come across in your last year in class 9. We'll discuss more in details about these three terms, and we'll connect this with the GDP and its contribution, sector's contribution towards the employment. Okay, so I leave you here, but don't forget that I am attaching one homework which I am sharing here. This is question number 24, page number 37. This is a question. We have already done this sort of a discussion yesterday and today. It's basically where the primary, secondary and tertiary sectors in the year 2000 and 2013, their amounts are given, their contributions towards the economy are given in the table, in crores, in rupees. Okay, but you have to calculate their share of percentage in these 2 years, and I'm sure you all will be able to do that. Then we'll also show the same thing in the graph, a graph which is similar to the graph number 2 that we just discussed. And finally, from the graph you analyze and tell me what have you understood. So don't try to copy anything from the NCERT book or the solutions given in all the various apps. I will rather know if you do that. Rather you understand and let me give the answer to you in your next class, right? So this is basically what we have covered today, and I'll see you all again next week. And don't forget to submit the homework on 23rd of May. Thank you. Have a nice day.